Okay, thank you very much. And good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of week 4 of the Land Reuse Conference. My name is Tom Arthur. I'm the MSP for Renfrewshire South, and I'm the Minister for Public Finance, Planning and Community Wealth. And I'm delighted to be here this morning to launch the Scottish Land Commission's guidance on community wealth building and indeed to chair the panel discussion. And the panel discussion will be the substantive item on our agenda, which we'll come to shortly. And I'm delighted to say that we're joined this morning by Gemma Campbell, Good Practice Manager at the Scottish Land Commission, Rachel Bentley, Associate Director at CLES, and Dr Carey Doyle, Urban Hub Manager at Community Land Scotland. With that, we will shortly move on to the panel discussion. But beforehand, I thought it might be helpful just I made a few remarks to give a bit of background and context and an update to the work that we are undertaking in the Scottish Government around community wealth building. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, community wealth building has been adopted by the Scottish Government as a key policy, and we see it with a real potential to deliver on our well-being economy objectives at the local and regional level, helping to build an economy for all people in Scotland to ensure that they enjoy greater wealth, health and opportunity. Again, I'm sure you'll be aware that at the beginning of this month, we published our 10-year National Strategy for Economic Transformation. This strategy will put us on a path to net zero economy, restore our natural environment, stimulate innovation, create new jobs, and further embed fair work principles. I think we would all recognise that we must take a broader view of what it means to be a prosperous economy, society and country, moving beyond traditional attitudes and measures of growth and ensuring that our economy puts people and the environment at the heart of economic activity. The new strategy outlines how we will make those choices and deliver change for all of Scotland by delivering on 5 key areas over the next 10 years. The 5 programmes of action focus on stimulating entrepreneurship, opening new markets, increasing productivity, developing the skills we need for the decade ahead, and ensuring fairer and more equal economic opportunities. The programmes are based on a rigorous analysis of evidence, designed to tackle long-term structural challenges, build on our economic strengths, and position Scotland to maximise the greatest economic opportunities of the next 10 years. Our COVID recovery strategy, published last year, features a wide range of actions to rebuild our economy and secure a recovery that is both green and fair. As part of this, we are committed to supporting all local authorities in Scotland to develop and implement community wealth building action plans as part of their local recovery activity or recovery activity they want to embark upon with neighbouring authorities in their region. The 2021 programme for government confirmed our plans to introduce legislation on community wealth building during this parliamentary session. From our perspective, community wealth building is a refinement of our approach to economic development. It's a strategic and practical 5-pillar model which provides a new consolidated partnership framework for much of the work that we are already undertaking. The legislation we plan to introduce will attempt to remove any blockages impeding the further embedding of community wealth building in Scotland. Community wealth building helps public sector anchor organisations with ties to localities to see themselves as economic agents, recognising that the levers at their control under each of the 5 pillars: spend, workforce, land and property, finance and inclusive ownership, using these to enhance decision making and have greater influence over the local economy in which they operate. You may be aware of the work underway in our pilot areas in Lochmanshire, South of Scotland, Western Isles, Tay Cities Fife and Glasgow City region. You may also be aware of the outstanding work that has been taking place in the Ayrshire region, which the Scottish Government is supporting through the Growth Deal. These areas have been examining how the 5 community wealth building pillars guiding economic development strategies can bring about the system change required to develop a well-being economy. In addition to our pilot areas, we are seeing approximately a third of our local authorities developing community wealth building strategies. I wanted to take the opportunity to highlight some of the key actions underway, focusing on the land and property pillar. Now, we all understand how much land matters. We all use it, we need it, it's a fundamental economic input. The ways in which we own and use land influence many parts of our everyday lives, from the price and availability of housing, access to green space, the effects of derelict sites on our communities, our ability to take climate action, or simply the means and confidence for people to build businesses and communities. Land has an important role to play in building a well-being economy that promotes inclusive economic growth, reduces inequality, supports climate action and a just transition, and empowers people and communities to bring about positive changes. Within Glasgow City region, for example, the local authorities and their partners see vacant and derelict land as an issue that needs to be addressed. Within Glasgow, a resident is no more than 500 metres away from a piece of derelict or vacant land. By bringing this vacant and derelict land back into good use, we may see many social and economic benefits for businesses, people, and the planet. In the Western Isles, we are now seeing up to 70% of the land being in community ownership, and we are seeing the development of homes, business premises, and municipal energy production that supports local communities to thrive and grow. And a number of areas, including North Ayrshire, Fife, and indeed the Western Isles, are exploring the use of land as a tool to develop a greener economy in the form of community energy production, bringing the once vacant and derelict land back into productive use. A number of the pilot areas are developing their understanding of the assets held by public sector anchor institutions, such as health boards, education institutions, and local authorities, and importantly, working to understand their community wealth building potential. In addition to taking a place-based approach to economic development through community wealth building, we are committed with CLES to delivering the place principle through a place-based investment programme, for example. This is an active 5-year programme to accelerate our policy ambitions through 20-minute neighbourhoods, community-led regeneration, and town centre revitalisation. The Place and Wellbeing Programme, being taken forward by colleagues in the Health and Social Care Directorate, supports local level action by applying a place-based approach to enable our health and social care providers to become active anchor institutions and support the building of wealth locally and addressing the root causes of health inequalities. As Planning Minister, I have been leading on the work around National Planning Framework 4, the draft of which is currently under consideration. And this includes specific and clear policy support for community wealth building in Scotland, for spatial strategies to use the 5-pillar model, reiterating community wealth building as a place-based strategic and practical approach to local economic development that seeks to effect change to the local economic system. This proposed approach intends to place more of the benefits arising from significant developments in the hands of local communities, making economic growth more inclusive, applying the community wealth building principles to enable better outcomes for localities, its residents and businesses. In this, community wealth building works to ensure that planning supports development activities that support forms of ownership where wealth is retained locally through good employment opportunities and increased use of local supply chains, which supports the circular economy and our net zero ambitions. In addition, the Land Reform Bill, planned for later in this parliamentary term, will look to ensure that land uses and land use supports our ambitions for a well-being economy that helps us to transition towards and indeed beyond net zero. I think we are all agreed that there is enormous potential within the community wealth building model, and I'm very keen that its practicality is demonstrated and proven as we consider legislating for implementation of the approach in Scotland. I very much welcome the launch of the Land Commission's Community Wealth Building Guide as a practical and helpful addition to the implementation and embedding of the community wealth building approach. How we collectively own and use land is an important element in building a wellbeing economy that promotes inclusive growth, addresses inequalities, and supports climate action. By aligning community wealth building with the place principle and the Scottish Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, this guide provides a helpful framework and excellent suggestions for how to put this into action. There are 6 headline areas for action: supporting net zero ambitions and sustainable development, positive management of land and assets, productive reuse of land and buildings, collaboration and partnership, supporting economic growth and community aspirations, and sharing information. And I look forward to continuing to work collaboratively with my ministerial colleagues and indeed with MSPs across the Scottish Parliament and key stakeholders, including the Land Commission, to ensure the planned community wealth building legislation cements and augments the vital role we all play in advancing a well-being economy. We will ensure that we not only share our experiences, but learn from those localities across the world, taking a community wealth building approach. So on that note, I'm going to pause there, and I hope that provided some useful context about some of the work that we've been undertaking in the Scottish Government. We are now going to move towards the panel element of this morning's session. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak in turn for about 3 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions, and following which I will endeavour to take as many of those questions from the chat bar as possible. But can I begin by inviting Gemma to offer her contribution?
Thank you so much, Minister, for launching that guidance. And huge thanks, before I start speaking about anything else, to our expert steering group and to all of the stakeholders who have fed into this. People have given their time and their wisdom so generously, and it has really helped to bring this guidance to life. So as the Minister said, a community wealth building approach to managing land and property, underpinned by the Scottish Government's Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, offers a really helpful framework for how land can support the delivery of a wellbeing economy. We've been speaking over Land Reuse Month about the opportunities and about the activities that are taking place to bring land back into productive use, and that's just one element of the guidance. And the public sector plays a really key role in supporting land rights and responsibilities and in building community wealth by acting as anchor institutions. Public sector organisations have a substantial impact on local economies through spending, investment, employment, and of course through their use of land and buildings. And we know that many positive actions are already being taken by the public sector, and we've seen those through the development of the guidance, through the pilot areas that the Minister has mentioned and beyond. And this guidance that we've developed is really intended to support that work, to work alongside the existing activity and to inform and support new and existing strategies and policies to help develop more sustainable and resilient places. The guidance really recognises the important role that public bodies play in owning, using and influencing the use of land and assets. And the actions are intended to provide a kind of short and long-term support and provide a framework for assessing what's happening, what actions could be taken, and what good practice is happening and could be shared with others. So I'm now going to ask Claire to bring up our animation that we've had developed to support the guidance, and you can see a little bit more about what it covers.
Putting people at the centre of our local economies is at the heart of community wealth building. Making sure that the control of assets and resources and the benefits they bring are in the hands of the local people can help keep the wealth generated in the local economy, creating a fairer, greener and more equal Scotland that empowers communities to bring about positive changes. How we own, manage and use our land is key to community wealth building and forms one of 5 pillars of the approach. Spending, inclusive ownership, fair work, finance, land and property. These pillars help organisations to understand the changes they can make to build a strong local economy that works for everyone. Underpinned by the Scottish Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, land and property is about owning and managing land and buildings in ways that grow the social, financial, environmental and economic value that local communities gain from the assets. Our guidance for public bodies that own, manage, use and influence the use of land and buildings in Scotland helps organisations to take actions that support community wealth building and contribute to 1. Supporting net zero ambitions and sustainable development. 2. Positive and proactive management of land and assets. 3. Proactively tackling vacant and derelict land. 4. Collaboration and partnership with communities and wider stakeholders. 5. Supporting sustainable economic growth and community aspirations through more diverse ownership and management. 6. Sharing information about land and buildings in an open and transparent way. Working to make more of Scotland's land for everyone. Find out more about land and community wealth building and check out our guidance and good practice case studies on our website at landcommission.gov.scot.
Thanks, Claire. That's great to see that come together. So you can see a bit from that video about what's in our guidance, and we would really encourage those who are anchor institutions, who are considering their role as anchor institutions, to think about how they own, use and manage land within their own organisation and in collaboration with stakeholders, including local communities. And you know, there is an opportunity for bodies who want to discuss it to get in touch with us at the Commission. And we're always happy to speak to you about land use, about land rights and responsibilities, and to support in any way that we can. I will now hand over to Rachel, who will talk to you a bit about her work at CLES.
Thanks, Gemma. And it's great to be here today. And every time we come to do any work in Scotland, we're always inspired by the scale of work that's going on, but also the pace of change. So I wanted to mention briefly the work that we did in Glasgow City region in late 2020, which probably feels like a lifetime ago now. But we were asked to bring a fresh set of eyes to the issue of vacant and derelict land in the region, and just to see what community wealth building could do to extend the kind of pockets of good work into a kind of groundswell of action across the region. And like all of our work in Scotland, we found no shortage of progressive policy ideas. We found experienced and dedicated practitioners. We found evidence of collaboration across sectors and also within the public sector. And we found some real shining examples of successful implementation, but it was clear that there were barriers to making a kind of more catalytic change. And we summed these up as 3 failures: one of finance, one of planning, and one of actors. And it was clear to us that to overcome these barriers required a kind of bold public sector-led approach, but that was really people-centred, and it would be costly, it would require long-term political commitments, and it needed to be joined up across those dimensions that Mr. Arthur mentioned. And the other thing that we found working in the Glasgow City region, which will be no stranger to anyone who lives and works there, is, you know, coming together as a city region had really brought kind of collaboration, but it also highlighted the real differences that exist even just within that area in terms of, you know, certain member authorities have real challenges around sites that have been left from the legacy of the loss of heavy industry. And then in other areas, you were talking about much smaller pockets of vacant and derelict land. But there was this clear link, very much evidence through the GIS data and the SIM data of that link with inequality. And that was why, you know, this kind of need for action, catalytic action was needed because of the effect that it was having upon people. And I think we're all here, you know, having been, well, still going through this tremendously crushingly depressing time that we're going through, but that is what's kind of really driving, I think, progressive action forward that we see across Scotland. So I just wanted to talk about those three brief points. So one about this failure of finance. What we found, we were looking at the Scottish Land Commission's report onto vacant and derelict land, and we saw that there was 41 separate pots of funding to deal with vacant and derelict land, and we thought, wow, that's great, how marvelous, loads of money out there. But actually what we were hearing from the member authorities and community groups and other actors is that's too much. It's too fragmented. It creates this kind of bidding bingo, and that actually, instead of being something that kind of moves action forward, it can actually prevent it. The failure of planning was that kind of real link to kind of hope value, this kind of mindset that many people in economic development have, that development or regeneration has to be developer-led, and kind of getting set in that mindset. But the Scottish Land Commission, once again, they had found that this idea of dusties, these sites which had laid dormant since at least 2022, and we saw data from Clyde Plan that had shown that they were actually ready for development. They were sitting there ready to go for residential and commercial development, but it wasn't coming. The private sector was not going to come and develop that land. So there had to be this public sector intervention. And then finally, that issue of actors, with land, like whose job is it? Whose job is it to tackle these issues? So what you say you may have for a massive, contaminated site is going to require very different action to what is needed to a little micro site. So enabling those communities, to really act, and to say, look, actually, feel free to take on this space. So they were the three findings that we came to. And so our conclusion, and I won't go through the 9 recommendations because we don't have time, but it was really, the first thing was that kind of really rethinking purpose, rethinking this idea that was so entrenched that land is a commodity. So really rethinking about that and getting away from this idea of this binary issue of kind of ownership and use. Thinking those binary terms does not really get us anywhere, and starting to think about stewardship. So stewardship for communities, stewardship for people, stewardship for the planet, and also stewardship for future generations. What are we really doing with these land and assets? And I think that's where community wealth building can bring that different approach that starts to say, actually, this is our shared resource, and what can we do that will strengthen our kind of local places and local economies. So I don't know if that was 3 minutes, but I will stop talking now and hand over to Carey.
Nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation from the Land Commission. I'm Carey Doyle. I'm from Community Land Scotland, where I head up an action research project on community ownership in the Clyde Valley. Community Land Scotland is a membership organization for community landowners. Our members manage over 500,000 acres of land and hundreds of assets across Scotland. In 2020, actually, there are over 600 assets of different bits of land and building owned by more than 400 community groups. Now, Scotland has world-leading community ownership and land reform legislation, which is an absolutely amazing foundation for community wealth building. And Community Land Scotland really supports this new community wealth building guidance from the Land Commission. It'll be extremely useful in underpinning more collaborative working between public bodies and communities. It sets out a vision for how we can move forward on the pillar of land and property within community wealth building, which is such an important step forward in the right direction. The guidance is very clear on the importance of land and buildings in creating a fairer Scotland and in building community wealth. Now, in terms of vacant and derelict land, there's an issue here around an extractive economy, which has spatial implications resulting in vacant and derelict land, which Rachel and Gemma and Tom have all touched on, which is great that there's so much consensus around the nature of these challenges.
George.
Oh.
Not so bad yet.
Community, someone needs to mute themselves. So to think about the community ownership role in all of this, community-owned land and buildings recycle wealth and income and opportunity locally. So it's building this more inclusive economy where more people can share in the wealth of land and buildings. Communities don't lack ambition. We speak to them daily. It's impressive. We're always impressed by the scale of what communities want to achieve and have achieved already. And they're best placed to understand what is needed in their local areas. Local authorities with their assets and resources are centrally placed to collaborate with communities to deliver against that need. And this is a new model, as you can think about, in terms of stewarding land forward and integrating the approaches to who owns and benefits from land, communities, and public bodies. Now, communities have proven that they can deliver as property owners and build local wealth. Community land ownership is an urban and rural phenomenon now across all property assets, including lots of vacant and derelict land projects. We've got loads of examples here, which I'd be happy to talk about in our discussion. To take a few, the community in South Uist delivered a £10 million regeneration harbour scheme. There's community-owned renewables across Scotland, which are producing renewable energy, but also producing community wealth, which then community bodies are reinvesting locally in that cycle of community wealth building. There's amazing things happening in our towns and cities. In Royston Hill in Glasgow, the community owns a community hub, which is a regenerated listed building. They're tackling vacant and derelict land locally. They've got community-led housing authorities, which are working with a local development trust and have close connections with their councillors and their local authority officers, all delivering on a vision for that small part of Glasgow. So that's what each local place really needs ultimately, is a self-sustaining network of community-led work, partnership working. Government has a central role to play in supporting all of this. There's great international examples from CLES, and there's so much to be learned, for example, from Chicago. I was at some talks recently, which is really great from that public body perspective, but also public bodies in Scotland are doing great work. I was just talking about Royston Hill. Dumfries is doing amazing things, and I think we're hearing from someone later this morning about that. And the enterprise agencies have a key role in facilitating all of this as well. Very much a collaborative approach. Communities have a central role in delivering this on the ground and keeping that wealth locally. One thing that if you take one thing away from all of this, what I would say is that the potential for community wealth building from a public authority perspective is much more than public body assets. It's about the step change, it's about the system change that's needed. It's a whole place approach, acting over all types of land to deliver this wealth locally. We really welcome the inclusion of community wealth building in the MPF4. I think that's a key tool in implementing these vision for community wealth building on land and buildings. Moving forward, more support is needed to implement these visions. This is support for local authorities as well as communities to deliver on the potential of the tools we're being given, like local place plans, for example. And finally, then, community wealth building, it's a new economic model that we're implementing here. It's bigger than the local authority processes, but local authorities are central to this delivery. Community Land Scotland called for a community wealth fund last year, and at that time it was to grasp the windfall, the financial windfall of the offshore renewable leasing round, proposing this could be set up as a fund to benefit communities nationally. Imagine what communities across Scotland could do if they had access to a regular income from a community wealth fund. And it would move away from grant dependency. It would provide a way through the fragmented funding environment that Rachel was talking about. And then it would allow us to replicate those powerhouse success stories that we hear about, Egg or Galston or Knoydart across Scotland. So there's big potential here, and I'm looking forward to some discussion and questions. Thank you.
Carey, thank you very much, and thank you also to Gemma and Rachel. I have not spotted any questions in the chat bar as of yet. We have about another 10 to 15 minutes, so please, if you do have a question for anyone on the panel, indeed all of the panel, please put it into the chat bar and I will endeavour to take it. I was really struck by all of the presentations. I think a few points that jumped out for me. I think firstly, just as a sort of a rallying call, what Rachel said about these crushingly depressing times that we live in, actually been a real fillip and driver and motivator to be as ambitious and as energetic as possible in advancing our progressive agenda. It is no antidote in itself to much of the gloom that we feel, but it certainly allows us to have a sense of purpose. And I think the way in characterising this almost reframing or paradigm shift of how we think around land from rather just, I think, the use or ownership to stewardship is so important. And I think that's absolutely central to our commitments around the a just transition to net zero, and also that intergenerational approach, seeing just beyond our own generation in regards to how we think about economic development and what we leave for the next generation. I think as well, Carey made some really important points that are central to my thinking as we move forward in developing community wealth building legislation around recognising the central importance of local authorities, but it's not just about local authorities, and ensuring there's that wider collaboration across not just the public sector, but the private sector, third sector, and crucially, social enterprises and more pluralistic forms of business ownership. Also, the key point of the role of ensuring that communities are included. So one of the questions I think I'd like to pick up on and pose, I suppose, to each of the panel members, is how do you think we can achieve that genuine collaboration across not just the public sector, but with other partners as well, and crucially within that to ensure communities are fully involved? I'm going to put that question to Gemma. I notice that Christian has his hand up. Christian, if you please type your question into the chat bar, I'll pick it up and I will pose it to the panel following their answers to the question that I've just said. So maybe just start off with Gemma.
Thank you. I think when it comes to collaboration and collaboration across sectors, we've got some great guidance and tools and documents out there that people can use if they're not sure where to start. We've got things like the Place Standard tool, we've got the Scottish Government's own guidance on engaging communities in decisions relating to land, and at the Commission we have templates for engagement plans, we have route maps, and we've got protocols that can support these things. But really it takes a lot of honesty and openness and transparency really it's about building that trust and sharing information. And we've seen some fantastic examples of collaboration, in particular North Ayrshire, who have been a real powerhouse in terms of community wealth building in Scotland, have done some great work. We've got examples from their annual report on community wealth building, with the likes of their project at Glengarnock, which is a former vacant derelict site, which has a lot of input from other public bodies, from the local authority, and with opportunities for communities there. So I think it's about being open to what the possibilities are, not doing things the same way because that's how they've always been done. It's about being brave enough to try something new if that's something that is different to you.
Thank you, Gemma. Rachel?
When we start to use the word community, we start to talk, we think about volunteer hours. And I think it's really important to recognise that if you are doing something on a large scale or something, kind of long term, relying on volunteer hours is not going to necessarily get you the same results in all places. So really thinking about, what are the opportunities that can kind of create jobs, bring people in a way that is not relying on those volunteer hours, because something we often hear is about capacity. It is not the same in all places. So thinking about and that kind of more strategic, like if we think about community energy, for example, this is not something that you can build in all places relying on volunteer hours. So thinking about that, really trying to bring people in and I guess that point around what is in it for somebody, it isn't always, the same results. And that, I think, once again links into that point around where you find these sites and the areas of deprivation, and kind of asking communities to kind of take it on and kind of really drive it isn't going to result in the same outcomes in different places.
Thank you, Rachel. Carey?
Yeah, so my day-to-day work is supporting community groups and individuals who are exploring their rights and tools over land in the Clyde Valley. They get in touch with questions, and it's often questions about sites at the end of their street or some type of approach like that. And there is no lack of interest in communities in addressing land issues. Maybe it's because of COVID and the lockdowns and people are starting to look at their local places differently. Who knows? But our emerging outcomes is that the interest in land use is so much higher than we expected, which has kept us really busy and is absolutely great. We have an evolving evidence base on what community groups are interested, and 2/3 of the groups we're working with are in the top 20% most deprived areas. So there's a great deal of interest in these questions. The difficulty then is taking that interest and turning it into exercising communities' rights and tools over land. So connecting those dots up, as it were. The communities we work with are interested in collaborative working to address large-scale land issues in their local areas, but they often struggle to get a seat at the table, as it were, for large-scale regeneration schemes. So if we're prioritizing the biggest, most tricky sites, what is the community's role in that? And Rachel has rightly sort of taken a critical approach to that. Where do communities fit in with this? I think community wealth building offers a great model to start taking some of that wealth and building in systems that communities can benefit from, even if they're not ready to come to the table now with a fully formed development trust and all of that with officers in place, working towards a position when they will be in 5 years' time or whatever that is. There's emerging good practice, for example, in large scale developments, providing that community benefit through the planning system, which makes decisions about planning obligations and things, but providing that as community owned resource for the future. So embedding a new system of land use and ownership that will be managed in the longer term.
Thank you, Carey. And I think some of that latter points we're making picks up in the question that Alistair Gemma has raised in the chat bar, which is asking about the main ways national and major developments can contribute to community wealth building objectives, obviously looking at it in the context of NPF4 and how the planning system can promote this. And I'll obviously highlight, as we're aware, the policy 5 within the 35 policies in NPF4, and also the work that we're going to undertake as we look at Section 75 agreements and the provisions within the Planning Act around an infrastructure levy. So there's various pieces of work that are ongoing in government. I maybe wanted to come back to you, Rachel, just picking up on a question that Valerie McNeice has posed in the chat bar, and it touches on looking at solutions to the failure of finance that you had mentioned. And Valerie asked, how might the currently fragmented sources of funding for VDL become more joined up to allow change at the scale and pace that is needed for people and communities to see and feel the change?
Yeah, so I think, often, our answer is we need more money, and that is true, but it's also about how it's being shared. As say, this getting away from this idea of this kind of bidding bingo, these kind of short-term framing. It does have to be kind of longer term, more freedom to act. And one of the things I think we hear criticism at all levels. We hear criticism from local authorities about how they receive funding, but we also hear criticism from community groups about how they receive funding from local authorities and how it's made available and the burdens that are placed on them. So I think it's about, as I say, trying to almost get away from that very kind of risk-averse approach, which says, we're going to give you this bit of money, prove to us what you can do, give us some great long explanation, and then we'll see what you did. When actually there does need to be a bit of a leap of faith. Going back to Carey's point, there is no shortage of interest, there is no shortage of ideas, and it's really about kind of making sure that funding is not just available for capital projects, it's really available as well for kind of the support, the resource that's going to actually deliver those projects as well. But as I say, I think it does require a shift in mindset, that goes away from that, traditional risk-averse approach. And I think also, there will be criticism of it. Are you spending money wisely? Is it creating the successes? And one of the things that I just wanted to say, often we hear a lot about community asset transfers, and that's a great idea and there's great policies and, that there are really good examples, but all too often it's a community liability transfer. You're taking something that isn't working in its current form and you're asking communities to take it on. So it does need to be accompanied by that kind of longer term funding that really provides the support to get to that place in 5 years' time that Carey was talking about, because it isn't necessarily going to happen overnight. So I don't know, Val, if that answers your question.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm conscious that we're rapidly running out of time, so I want to come to Gemma with a question that's been posed by Fiona Jackson. That's the question is the role of regional land use partnerships and frameworks a crucial tool and mechanism for community wealth building? Goes on to say about supporting meaningful and innovative engagement of the community is long-term and resource heavy, and also raises issues of the capacity of small rural community-led anchor bodies and how crucial they are. I don't know if you maybe want to offer some reflections on that question, Gemma.
Yes, I think there is a role there for regional land use partnerships to think about how they can act in a way that supports community wealth building. Ultimately, it is a place-based approach, but it's on a much larger scale when it comes to regional land use partnerships. But there are pilot areas for regional land use partnerships just now, looking at how the governance works, how people can work together and collaborate. So actually there are probably lessons both ways for these things. And I absolutely appreciate Fiona's point that meaningful and innovative engagement is long-term and it is resource heavy. We do see issues where communities are over-engaged and over-consulted and feel like they're constantly being asked for their opinion and not necessarily seeing the actions that go with that. So I think it does come back to that collaboration, thinking about who else is in consulting and engaging. How can you join the dots and work together to make these things more streamlined and to take away some of the kind of time intensity and you know, resource heaviness that is there. And absolutely smaller rural areas really do struggle, and it's this approach with community wealth building. It's about bringing people together, supporting each other, and Rachel and Carey have touched on it already, but it's about you know, not relying on volunteer hours, not making assumptions about what communities can do. And I think a lot of that comes down to asking and really listening to what's being said, listening to what the needs are, what the aspirations are, and thinking about you know, what you can do to make things easier for these communities.
Thank you very much. Look, I'm afraid we have run out of time for this part of the session, but can I please just again pass on my thanks to Gemma, Rachel and Carey for their contributions. Can I thank everyone who's put forward questions, and just to reiterate, if I'm not been able to take your question in this session, please don't hesitate to email us, and we'll be happy to see about getting an answer back to you via email. But can I just conclude by saying I found this a very stimulating conversation. This is a very exciting time for across a range of areas. We have the National Strategy for Economic Transformation published earlier this month, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. But crucially, we have our National Planning Framework 4 draft consultation still out. The deadline is in a week's time. So if you haven't had a chance yet to respond, please do. There's also other consultations running on guidance for local development plans. We're going to be taking forward our work in community wealth building at pace, and I hope to be in a position in the coming weeks to provide more details on that and around opportunities to engage and feed in, and obviously working with an aspirations to introduce legislation later on in this Parliament. And so as an opportunity through what we're doing in planning and what we're doing in community wealth building to maximise engagement, take advantage of the new local place plans which have now been delivered via legislation. And I think we have to seize this moment in the excitement around planning in NPF4 and primarily community wealth building to really catalyse that change in the ground that we're seeing. So with that, I'll conclude and wish you the very best for the remainder of today's sessions. Thank you again.